I set myself a task of trying to think around what I called the grammar of worship, what it really means to worship, what the essence of it is, and how one's to understand the way that it influences and affects other things that one does. The grammar of worship, and I wanted to include in that the Bible, simply because it seems to me, firstly, that the Bible is crucial to pretty well every phrase in Catholic worship. Every word you can possibly have in Catholic worship is either from the Bible or is part of a biblical overarching format. But secondly, because it seems to me that the Bible is something of a problem among modern Christians in all churches, sects and denominations, except possibly for some parts of the Byzantine world. I think in the West, where the Enlightenment has affected us, Enlightenment with a capital E and Enlightenment with inverted commas around it in order to make it either a word of irony or a word of sarcasm. And so I want to get on to that today, but perhaps to start in a rather odd place. Because once upon a time, in ancient Greece, there was a poet called Homer. Homer was the first poet of the Western cultural literary movement. I think he probably coincided with the invention of writing. And he wrote a thing called an Iliad and a thing called an Odyssey. And he was almost of godlike status for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. He perhaps operated around about 800-ish BC, and he was of pretty well a divine status as the great person of literature, far and way above any sort of English preference for Shakespeare as the greatest Englishman. Homer was far more idolized even than a Shakespeare. And so right down to 1795, when a man called Wolf, or Wolf, wrote a thing called Prolegomena ad Homerum, an introduction to Homer. And he revealed to the world something that nobody had known since 800 BC down to 1795, that Homer was not composed as what his poems were not composed as one piece. He probably wasn't much earlier than 500-ish. In his poems there are interpolations that other people have bunged in, contradictions, inconsistencies, where something somewhere in the narrative contradicts something somewhere else in the narrative. The suggestion was that Homer might have written a few short poems, orally, mentally, without writing them down, which are then learnt by heart and handed on. Homer must have been a simple writer. I think you're doing incredibly well. I would have thought you would have been glazed over and asleep by now, wondering what on earth Homer could have to do with the study of the Bible and its relation to liturgy. Nevertheless, I'll carry on. There were 18th century prejudices which went into Wolf's. I love these German monosyllabic names, don't you? There were 18th century prejudices. A man called Rousseau, for example, 1712-ish to 1778-ish, believed that there had once been a natural, simple happiness which had now become impossible because of the complexity and restraints of artificial life, naturalness. People believed that early poetry must be simple and natural. yesterday in one of my conferences, I quoted something by one of the people I most dislike in this world, Mr. Wordsworth. Simple vigour, originality, spontaneity. Lachmann, he wrote 1837-ish to 1841-ish. He thought there were as many as 18 different poems, which some editors sometime had stitched together to make the two works of Homer. Homer now acquires, quotation marks, Homer now acquires again an aura of perhaps irony. No one great poet ever. There's no room in Lachmann's construction for a Homer, even a Homer who started it all. There are discrepancies, there are inconsistencies. For example, in Homer's poem, the Iliad, Book 1, Apollo, the god, has been shooting the Greeks, and Athene has prevented Achilles from being violent towards King Agamemnon, who wished to steal his girl. But then later on, the goddess Thetis tells us that the gods had all gone to visit the Ethiopians. So, these Homeric scholars, your Wulfs, your Lachmanns, they pointed out that the Thetis speech must be by a different author, because it contradicts the statement that Apollo and Athene were doing godlike and goddess-like things in the camp of the army. And we move on to Hermann. I'm going to spare you, Hermann, because I think your resilience has already been proved. Grote, I'm also going to spare you for a similar reason. A man called Hennings came along and believed that the Odyssey consisted of a poem about Odysseus and a poem about Telemachus. Somebody called Fieke, mumble, 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 mumble. Somebody called Wilamowitz, mumble, 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 mumble. Most of them Germans, which always reminds me of a university in England, Durham, I believe it is, where in the theology department they have a subject for the young men, the undergraduates, to study, which is called Modern Theology. And there are two papers that you have to write at the end of the course, and the young men, with this cynicism that the student, the cynicism that the young person so easily and so gracefully adopts, these two papers are known as Dead Germans 1 and Dead Germans 2. I hope I have sufficiently bored you. I have seen, however, too few yawns. I'd like to point out to you that after 5 minutes on Homer, you have learnt nothing whatsoever about Homer. I have to tell you that Homer was at once scintillating, sophisticated, and completely absorbing. He plays the most wonderful little tricks. You think he's talking about one thing, and then a single word makes it clear that in fact he's talking about something different, and you have to completely rearrange your understanding of what went before. There have been fewer, more engaging and sophisticated writers in the years since Homer than him. You get none of that if you read Wolf and Lachmann and Hermann and Fieke and Wilamowitz. Wilamowitz, actually, I abbreviated his name in full. It is the Graf, which means the nobleman, the Graf Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Merlendorf. So there. You got none of that. You got none of the glitter, the fascination of Homer. What did you get? You got enlightenment with the capital E and the inverted commas and the irony. You got enlightenment prejudice. The prejudices of an enlightenment that throws no light upon anything. An enlightenment, a movement in European cultural history, 700-ish into the 1800s, which perhaps had the motto, "Do not seek and you will not find." Prejudice, Enlightenment prejudice in favour of the natural man, the noble savage. Prejudice in favour of the primitive and the simple. No respect for Homer as a sophisticated writer, but a great deal of respect for something else. What they enormously respected was the scholarly academic establishment. Because Homer, instead of being a great poet, to be read, enjoyed, even laughed over, instead of Homer being that sort of person, Homer becomes an industry and an object for dissection and examination by professional academics who progress in their academic careers by writing a book which is even cleverer than the last book that was written, who progress by cutting up whatever it is they're supposed to be studying, not treating it with respect, but treating it with contempt. I am the great scholar who can take this elderly book over here and I can cut it up and tell you how it really comes to be the way that it is. I am the clever one. It's the Enlightenment approach to Homer is rather like being preoccupied with maggots on a corpse. Or, putting it perhaps slightly differently, it's rather like looking at a pretty girl and contemplating her exquisite harmonies and thinking how interesting it would be to cut her up and see what's inside. No respect at all for the object, in this case Homer, that one is looking at. So much for dead Germans for the time being, so much for Homer. I'd like now to introduce you to somebody called Ronald Knox, often known as Ronnie Knox, or if you want to be formal, Monsignor Knox, because just like the Hugh Benson that we are hearing about in refectory at the moment, Knox began life as a Church of England person, a Protestant. Indeed, he even began life as the son of a bishop, although whereas Bishop Benson was a sort of middle-of-the-road high churchman, Bishop Knox was a ravening evangelical with very Protestant instincts. He was a very clever boy, and he went to Oxford, and he was an even cleverer undergraduate. In the Oxford Union, where debates happen and would-be politicians hone their debating skills, he shone. He always had them rolling in the aisles, and his mind was so quick, he could write a limerick just like that, or rather compose one. We are told that one day he was sitting in his study with a number of other young dons. Don is an Oxford word, a Cambridge word too, for a university teacher. We don't say lecturers, we say dons. He was sitting in his room with another group of young dons, and somebody was looking at the newspaper and said, "Here's a marvellous expression, I think it comes from America, the Bishop-elect of Vermont." And in the time that it took for Knox to swing his legs round off the window seat and stand up, he came up with, "An Anglican vicar in want of a second-hand portable font will exchange for the same a photo with frame of the Bishop-elect of Vermont." And he also devised this limerick: "O God, for as much as without thee we are not enabled to doubt thee, help us all by thy grace to convince the whole race it knows nothing whatever about thee." And he was not only brilliant in English, he was equally brilliant in Latin and Greek. If you wanted to remember the value of pi, to 30 places of decimals. Knox could help you because he wrote a Greek poem in which, if you counted the number of letters in each word, it gave you a digit. 5-letter word, 5. And so, pi to 30 places of decimals, just learn Knox's little Greek poem, and you are laughing. Knox was an Anglo-Catholic, as indeed Hugh Benson was for a part of his life, wasn't he? And he was a priest. He used to come down to the church. This was long before my time, of course. The last Anglican church that I looked after, St. Thomas's in Oxford, Ronald Knox used to come down there because he was chaplain of Trinity, and when he was on the rota to celebrate the Eucharist in Trinity Chapel, he had to use the Book of Common Prayer. When he wasn't, he would come down to St. Thomas's and use one of our altars there to say what we nowadays call the extraordinary form in Latin. He and a group of friends put together a society called the Society of St. Peter and St. Paul, which published Baroque Catholicizing liturgical books. And they described it as, on the front page of all the books they produced, as publishers to the Church of England. And since the Church of England, of course, particularly disliked the sort of Anglo-Catholic liturgical rites which were so exquisitely printed, this caused a certain degree of disquiet and irritation. They also produced a stand for votive candles, such a votive candle stand as you put in front of the statue of a saint, and then light a candle and say your prayer. Remembering that in the English Reformation there had been 2 Protestant bishops who were executed by burning, and remembering also that one of them, Latimer, had said to the other, Ridley, Master Ridley, we shall light today in England such a candle as shall never be put out. They called their pricket stand a Latimer and Ridley candle stand. Again, this was not the sort of thing that the establishment of the Church of England particularly liked. He was a Don. He was clever. He was therefore expected, as clever Dons were, from time to time to read a paper to an undergraduate society. If there was a Don who was regarded as both clever and witty, undergraduate societies in the University of Oxford would ask him for a paper. And I'll read a little bit from Knox's spiritual autobiography, called A Spiritual Aeneid. The occasion of my discovering which way my mind was pointing may be thought a frivolous one. It is part of the functions of a Don to read papers to undergraduate societies. I thought I would write 2. One for theological societies about St. Paul, and one for secular societies on Sherlock Holmes. The latter, the Sherlock Holmes one, was written first, and the former, the one on St. Paul, proved unnecessary. I had no sooner read my Sherlock Holmes paper about the end of 1910 that I realized that it would do for theological societies as well. It was interpreted as a tract. There was no particular reason why it should have been. Sherlock Holmes, what's that got to do with theology, you would naturally think. I had no clear idea what sort of criticism I was setting out to satirize. I divided up the Holmes story about Sherlock Holmes as a form of literary art into 11 characteristic divisions, each with its Greek name. Perhaps the penny is starting to drop in your minds. He is thinking of satirizing the sort of approach to Homer that I was describing a few minutes ago. 11 characteristic divisions, each with a Greek name, and showed how more were present in some stories, fewer in others. I gave an elaborate study of Holmes's view of life, and a still more elaborate study of Dr. Watson's. I declared Watson's bowler hat to be a symbol of almost religious significance. But I did also invent a whole controversy, diversified with the names of various imaginary German scholars, on the question of the authenticity of several stories, showing the reasons for pronouncing some of them, on internal evidence, to be the work of a different hand. Here is one of them. This is Ronnie Knox's mock-learned, mock-academic takeoff of German scholarship. We all know, of course, that Sherlock Holmes only had one author. Conan Doyle wrote all the stories. There's absolutely no reason to think that he didn't. And so the satire, because this is satire, that Ronnie Knox is doing, is to treat something that everybody knows was written at one time by one person, in the sort of way that the German scholars of the last 2 centuries had treated Homer, and to show the absurdity of their conclusions. Any studies in Sherlock Holmes must first and foremost be studies in Dr. Watson. Let us treat at once of the literary and bibliographical aspect of the question. First, as to authenticity. There are several grave inconsistencies in the Holmes cycle. For example, the study in Scarlet and the reminiscences are from the hands of John H. Watson. But in the story of the man with the twisted lip, Mrs. Watson addresses her husband as James. The present writer, together with 3 brothers, wrote to ask Sir Arthur Conan Doyle for an explanation, appending their names in the proper style with crosses after them, and an indication that this was the sign of the fraud. The answer was that it was an error, in fact, of editing. As the great Salvosh says, nothing else is concealed here except for a most ignorant redactor. Yet this error gave the original impetus to Bakalak's theory of Deutero Watson, to whom he assigns the study in Scarlet, the Gloria Scott, and the return of Sherlock Holmes. He leaves to Proto-Watson the rest of the memoirs, the adventures, the Sign of Four, and the Hound of the Baskervilles. The Gloria Scott story further represents Percy Treller's bulldog as having bitten Holmes on his way in college down to the channel, which is clearly untrue, since dogs are not allowed within the gates of any college at either university. The bulldog is more at home, he adds, on the chapel steps than this fraudulent imitation among the divine products of the Watson genius. The further objection to the Gloria Scott is that it exhibits only 4 divisions out of the 11-fold divisions of the complete Holmes episode, a lower percentage than is found in any other genuine story. You see how one can take the ways in which Homer was chopped up, treated with no respect, and the scholar showed his ingenuity by proving that this could all be written by the same person. It's taken and simply made into a laughing stock by this able young clergyman. What lay behind some of the things that Ronnie Knox said there, such as, for example, the Deutero-Watson and Proto-Watson, Deutero-Watson and Proto-Watson, that relates to biblical studies. Brethren and fathers, this is where I do get on to the scripture that I claimed I was going to be talking about. In the Old Testament, there is a book called the prophet Isaiah. And if you went into any academic library, possibly any seminary library, I wouldn't like to be too sure about it, and you picked an Isaiah commentary, a book about Isaiah off the shelves, you would undoubtedly discover that it dealt with a proto-Isaiah and a deutero-Isaiah, and if you were really lucky, if you were really in the money, also perhaps a trito-Isaiah. In other words, claiming that there were 3 writers, all of them in this one book, stitched together in the way that those German scholars stitched together Homer. So, 1753, somebody called Jean Astruc and Hobbes and Spinoza wrote books upon the contradictions, whether you had one name for God, Elohim, or another different name for God, tells you that one source, one writer wrote this and a different person wrote that. Moses comes nowhere out of this. Moses really can't have had anything to do with the composition of all this. And so you end up with something called the documentary hypothesis. And you end up with something called source criticism, which enables you to work out which sources, all the different bits of Isaiah or any other Old Testament book, the Heptateuch, come from, the Pentateuch come from. And in 1876, a man called Wellhausen, another Germans galore, claimed that there were 4 sources in the Pentateuch, and in doing so, of course, he was simply showing the same approach to the Old Testament as the Wolfs and the Lachmanns had shown towards Homer, because it all comes from the same intellectual background. It all starts in the same place. The fact that biblical studies, since 1750-ish, biblical studies in Western universities have been the way they are, is because, like the study of Homer, they start with the same presuppositions and therefore reach the same sorts of conclusions. I'll return to Knox's spiritual Aeneid. He began to look at the classical authors, and then he turned to the Bible. But he had written this paper that I quoted to you from to at least 3 societies in Oxford, the Sherlock Holmes paper, and 1 in London. It was published in a magazine edited chiefly by undergraduates, and won him, I'll read what he says, "It won me the privilege of a letter from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself, who did not quite seem to have realized that the criticism was not meant to be serious. But in theological Oxford, it was taken as an attack upon the methods of the capital H, capital C, higher criticism. Because that's what the people who got Isaiah and chopped him up called their work, the higher criticism. And I found myself already stamped as an opponent of that tendency. I was aroused against it in earnest as the result of preparation for delivering lectures on the Iliad. I read Professor Murray's Rise of the Greek Epic, and Andrew Lang's reply to it, Professor Geddes, Miss Stahl, Dr. Leaf's notes and introductions, the text itself, and finally 1 or 2 handbooks. I looked up all the references, balanced all the arguments, checked all the contradictions. I was not wearying my readers with technical stuff, but this is what I principally noted. Professor Murray, Professor Geddes, and Dr. Leaf all agreed that the Iliad was composite. In other words, written by different people and then just stitched together. But they did not in the least agree as to which were the early parts and which were the late parts. Moreover, the Stahl came in and further troubled their reckonings. Now, if one critic says that A part A is late and B is early, while another says A is early and B is late, and so on. You may believe either, but you can't simultaneously believe both, and you may begin to have suspicions that it's safer to believe neither of them. Now, when I had reached the conviction that the internal evidence of splitting up the air was not strong enough to hang a dog on, except in these cases where it so happened there was external evidence in antiquity, I began to be a little distrustful of critics and of handbooks altogether. And when I came to read the books on the Old Testament, as part of my preparation for my deacon's papers, a curious analogy caused me misgivings. I was only reading the handbooks, and even if I could have read the original critics themselves by learning German, I couldn't have got at my original documents without learning Hebrew. The splitting up of books into different strata of authorship on the ground of criteria arbitrarily assumed, the suspecting of interpolations everywhere merely in order to make the facts square with the theories, were in evidence here, just as in my Homeric authors, only I could not check the process, and I began to be less afraid when my handbooks talked to me about the consensus of expert opinion, that's in inverted commas, and the assured results of modern criticism, that's in inverted commas too. Because that's something that academic bullies liked then, and there are still academic bullies, and they still like it. If they and a few of their particular chants agree about something, it's not I and a few of my particular chants agree about something. It is the consensus of expert opinion. And if a little group of friends come to the conclusion that Homer is not really worth looking at, or that Isaiah is a rather peculiar book, that is then the assured results of modern criticism. Then Knox took to reading Griesbach on the Synoptics. I should perhaps explain that if you look at the four Gospels, three of them seem to stand a bit aside from the Gospel of St. John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have long passages in them which are the same, or nearly the same, in each of the three Gospels. If you look at the Greek words, the same particular words are being used in order to tell a particular story or to articulate a certain piece of the teaching of Jesus. This is called the synoptic problem. Notice that here the cunning word problem has been smuggled into the equation, because what it amounts to is that there is here a problem which needs a solution, and if you are a cunning scholar, then you are the person who is going to sell his books by providing a solution to the problem. The problem is, why are there these passages which are the same? Well, there are various answers to that, but the one that scholars of that generation latched onto was that some must have copied others. Somebody must have copied somebody else. They convinced themselves that everybody must have copied Matthew and Luke, must have copied Mark, because Mark is simple, comparatively, and spontaneous. Do you notice the prejudices of Enlightenment thinking coming in here? The preference for what is simple, spontaneous, unsophisticated. Mark, they claimed, was simple, unsophisticated. Therefore, that must be the first one. Copied by Matthew and Luke. encourages me, there are bits in Matthew and Luke which don't come from Mark, but are the same in Matthew and Luke. They can't have copied them from Mark because they're not in Mark. They decided that there must be a now lost book which Matthew and Luke were copying from. And they called it Matthew's source. The source from which they got the things they were reading about. But they didn't actually call it the source because they were Germans, and so they called it the Quelle. And then for short, they shortened Quelle to Q. And so the synoptic problem, you solve it by saying that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, and they also copied each of them from a now lost book called Q. You can buy, in the sort of shops that undergraduate students go to buy their university books, you can buy a book called a synopsis. On each page you have the 3 columns for Matthew, Mark and Luke, and thus you are able to compare them. And some students get very, very het up about all this. They really want to take it seriously. I once saw a New Testament which had been worked on by a woman undergraduate, in which she had devised a colour code for St. Luke's Gospel. One colour for the bits Luke has cribbed from Mark, a different colour for the bits that he's cribbed from Q, and a third colour for the bits that aren't in Mark or in Q, which he's found out from somewhere else. And she'd been through the whole of the Gospel, poor dear creature, wasting her life colouring every single word in St. Luke's Gospel with the appropriate colour. It's cruelty to dumb undergraduates. Griesbach, Weisser, the German scholars responsible for all this stuff, I think they have a lot to answer for. But particularly an Englishman called Streeter, who in the first half of the 20th century really became the Mr. Big in all this. I will return to a spiritual Aeneid by Monsignor Ronald Knox. With the New Testament, I was on my own ground once more. Scott, on the fourth Gospel, never seemed to me to state a general rule about his subjects to which I could not at once adduce a stultifying quantity of exceptions. I plastered the book with corrections. Schweitzer was even more provocative. Moreover, he was a pet of the Oxford theologians, who saw in his theory that Jesus of Nazareth was a fanatic and not far from a lunatic, a dexterous counter to the old German argument that he was merely a sublime moral teacher. I hope it doesn't seem disrespectful to our blessed Lord. It's not disrespectful to him, it's disrespectful to the conclusions drawn and the pictures drawn of our blessed Lord by successive generations of scholars. There is an entire subject in biblical studies as taught in universities, which is called the historical Jesus, because every single human generation or decade has a different picture of Jesus, which curiously, by a remarkable coincidence, seems to fit in awfully well with the intellectual preoccupations of that particular decade. For example, in the 1960s, the decade of demonstrations in universities, revolutionary movements all over Europe, particularly 1968, in that decade, Jesus was regarded as the revolutionary, probably rather like a guerrilla fighter, perhaps somebody really rather like Che Guevara leading the Cuban Revolution. The historical Jesus. And there have been about 15 historical Jesuses over the last 100 years, and as I said, they're actually an academic subject entirely on their own now. wrote an examination of Schweitzer's assumptions in the form of a pamphlet, which I had been asked to write for a series. It was not accepted, being probably badly written as well as over-orthodox. There's a problem there. The academic establishment never allowed something to be published which didn't fit in a general sort of way at least, with the way that the dominant spirits in the subject were thinking. So all this stuff I told you, which by the way was complete nonsense about the synoptic problem, about Mark and Matthew, about Q and the girl with all the colours in her Bible, it's actually complete and sheer nonsense from beginning to end. But there are about 60 years in which nobody who wrote a book or an article saying the nonsense stood much a chance of getting it published. You would just be pushed on one side as being nonsense, or as Knox puts it, not in accordance with the consensus of expert opinion and not fitting in with the assured results of modern criticism. Knox wrote his pamphlet. He'd been asked to write it, and when he'd written it, they didn't want it. But my doubts about the higher criticism were redoubled. I fell into a horrible scepticism, in which at times I lost all mannerly faith in the existence of Q. I could not accept the disbeliefs which the theologians propounded for my acceptance. If I was to go to heaven with the higher critics, it must be on the plea that invincible ignorance blinded me to the light of doubt.
You could perhaps get something written if you were already brilliant enough, if you had already made your name. And in 1955, an Anglican scholar, an Anglo-Catholic scholar called Austin Farrer, wrote an article called On Dispensing with Q. In other words, you don't need Q. If you've got bits in Matthew and Luke which are rather the same, why can't Luke just have copied Matthew, or the other way around? Statement of the obvious, you might think. He probably did while I was carrying on about standing over there talking about the synoptic problem. You may have thought, well, why not so-and-so and so-and-so? Austin Farrer pointed it out. And because he was the head of an Oxford college called Keble College, because he had already made an academic reputation by his sheer and persistent brilliance, he was able to get it published. It would just have been a scandal if people had suppressed something that such a distinguished scholar wanted to say. But as soon as he'd written it, of course, they had their arguments ready. As soon as he had written it, what they said was, too clever by half. That's the other answer. You write a clever book showing that what they say is nonsense, then they say too clever by half. And in 1951, a scholar, a Catholic scholar called B.C. Butler, Bishop Butler, wrote a book in which he suggested that Mark's Gospel, Mark, you remember, has to be the first Gospel because for the Enlightenment mind, Mark looks simple, spontaneous, and unsophisticated. Butler argued that, in fact, Matthew's Gospel was the first one to be written. He was able to get that printed in Catholic sources, but there was the comeback. This time it didn't have to be too clever by half. This time the comeback was, he only says that because he's a Roman Catholic. In other words, there is the way of dispensing with arguments you don't like by implying that the person writing the book had to come to that conclusion. The idea was that Catholics have to believe, which is perfectly untrue, Catholics have to believe that Matthew's Gospel was the first one to
be written. So we can discount Bishop Butler's book because, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I wonder if Australian members of the group know the origin of the phrase, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But perhaps it wouldn't be suitable. No, not for a retreat conference. So, there were cracks in the edifice of New Testament studies. Cracks in the edifice of the people who had the Enlightenment prejudices and wanted to put every phrase of every gospel into a different colour to show what its alleged source was. There was a man called Birger Gerhardsen, who died in 2013, who got something published because it was beginning to crack in the 1990s. He got something published which showed that rabbis in the time of Jesus used to teach their disciples by having the disciples learning things word for word off by heart. Well, if Jesus did that, that would account for why the teaching of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and John was in the same words, wouldn't it? You don't need to say, so-and-so has copied somebody else. If Jesus taught it, told the chaps to learn it off by heart, and they did so, then it's not surprising that the words are the same. Then, a man called John Robinson came onto the scene. He was a bishop of the Church of England, and he had made his reputation as being an extreme liberal. He wrote a book which must have raked in hundreds of thousands of pounds in royalties. It was called Honest to God, and it claimed that ordinary Christians believed that God was the sort of white-bearded old gent in the sky. I think that's a travesty, don't you, of what simple Christians of any church or denomination have ever thought. But that's the book that he wrote, and of course it became a great controversial thing. Then there was a question of a dirty book, which you may have heard of, called Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was banned on the grounds of obscenity. The publishers, however, wanted to publish it, and so a legal case ensued, and the publishers were able to bring lots and lots of interesting witnesses into the witness box, and Bishop Robinson was one of them, and he went into the witness box and said that this book about adultery and various other things, it was really quite a holy book, and it really treated sex in a very sacramental sort of way. And that again, of course, made a great deal of fuss in the big world at large. Vast enthusiasm for him on some sides, disgust, a bishop defending a pornographic book, disgust on other sides. That's the sort of person John Robinson was. He was a liberal, and he rather liked the limelight. But the last book that he wrote, which he didn't succeed in seeing published because he died of cancer before it was published, but one of his disciples saw it into the press, was called The Priority of John. Now, if there was one thing that the consensus of expert opinion and the assured results of modern criticism were absolutely sure about, was that John's Gospel was the last Gospel of the four to be written. They knew this for a dead certainty, because it was the most sophisticated. It was the most spontaneous. It was the Mark's Gospel is simple, unsophisticated, spontaneous, so that has to be the first one. John's Gospel is the most sophisticated, complicated,
erudite, the most literary of them, and so that has to be the latest. That old Enlightenment superstition of human culture as moving from the simple to the sophisticated. So whatever you find that's simple has to be early, and whatever you find that's sophisticated has to be late. John Robinson completely blew open that consensus. The priority of John, he argued, he deployed a very powerful argument that John's Gospel was the first one to be written. So much for John Robinson. But before leaving the question of which gospel comes first, I'd like to read something which again has nothing to do with biblical criticism directly, but I think throws a very fascinating light upon this whole subject of, if it's simple, if it's unspontaneous, it must be early. If it's sophisticated and complex, it must be later. In the last 120 years, archaeologists have excavated large rubbish dumps in Egypt. Sands of Egypt keep paper, papyrus, from rotting. And so large numbers of bits of paper, books, fragments of books have been unearthed. And they're all stored in tea chests underneath a particular museum in Oxford, and people are still working through them. There are vast numbers of these tea chests, and it's all a very lengthy business, because some of these bits of old papyrus are very dirty, some of them are torn. It's rather like sometimes putting a jigsaw together where half of the pieces are missing, that sort of thing. But a man called Professor Peter Parsons writes about this process of examining they call the Oxyrhynchus papyri. As usual, aesthetic prejudices and unquestioned categories lie below the scientific surface. Scholars used to regard Aeschylus's play The Suppliants as the earliest of his plays because it has a simple plot, little action, and long choruses. Now, a papyrus has dated it to, in other words, much later than everybody's thought. Simple play. Must be Aeschylus's first. No. These papyrus discoveries have proved quite the opposite. He says that there is this superstition among scholars that artists develop in a linear mode from simple to complex. In other words, if you had something written by a Mr. Smith, and then you had another thing written by the same Mr. Smith, and if one of them looked terribly, terribly simple, and one of them looked terribly, terribly complex, then you would assume that Mr. Smith wrote the simple one first. That's quite wrong. Now that we have Simonides' celebration of the Battle of Plataea, we see how he reinvented epic in elegy, etc., etc. Another false assumption that classical poets were all genius without artifice, and their successors all artifice without genius. In other words, again, it's a complete myth that writers are simple in the early days of human culture and became complex and sophisticated and brilliant later on. I think that's about an hour, Father Prior. I'd like to do the second half of this, finishing off biblical studies,
yes.
and getting on to something I hope more positive this afternoon.